Okay, now to discuss the future of Venezuela, let's meet our panel. Here in the studio, Paula Garcia Tufro. She is the Deputy Director of the Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Also with us, Max Blumenthal. He is a journalist and an author. And from Caracas, Edgardo Lander, a retired professor of sociology from Universidad Central de Venezuela. And Ramon Muchacho is a former Venezuelan politician, and he is joining us from Miami. Firstly, to our panel, I want to thank all of you for taking your time and look forward to the discussion. Max, I want to start with you. This new round of sanctions against Venezuela, the Trump administration claims that it is a nation in a humanitarian crisis, and the U.S. and others have to use basically everything at their disposal to try and push Maduro from power. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the new round of sanctions was imposed as the Barbados round of the Norway talks were underway, and the whole point of it was to break up the negotiations. The Trump administration and the bipartisan supporters of its policy of regime change in Washington say that all options are on the table except for dialogue. And so you have a full-scale embargo imposed on Venezuela, which is actually a form of financial terrorism. They aim to terrorize the civilian population in order to produce regime change at the top. And they're doing it by sanctioning things like the CLAP food program, which has fed 6 million families. 6 million families, which is a substantial portion of Venezuela's population. And I've been in Venezuela for almost 2 months this year. I've seen this program in action. It is not politicized, contrary to the lies of figures like Michelle Bachelet, and the Trump administration aims to prevent this program from taking place. We've heard Francisco Rodriguez, who is an advisor to the opposition leader, Henry Falcón, warned that if these sanctions continues, there will be a famine in Venezuela within a year. So what you see the Trump administration and its bipartisan supporters, the supporters of sanctions and regime change of an elected government aiming to impose on the Venezuelan population is famine, it is financial terrorism, and it's a war crime. The United States should be investigated at the International Criminal Court for this.
Well, Paula, pretty sobering analysis coming from Max, but the Venezuelan ambassador to the UN made some comments in this new round of U.S. sanctions against the nation. I want to go to his comments right now, and you can hear what he had to say.
But this is an act of war, what the United States is declaring against Venezuela, in front of everyone, for no reason. Venezuela is not a threat to anyone, and the United States is fabricating this aggression just to take the oil.
Paula, you think that's true? And what about the sanctions? Are they warranted? Is there some kind of coordinated measure needed to drive Maduro from power?
So without a doubt, the U.S. has had and put forward a consistent policy of ratcheting up economic pressure, has done a series of rounds of economic sanctions. Obviously, the latest rounds is the most dramatic in terms of putting a full freeze on all assets and property of the Venezuelan government. It is absolutely intended to put the pressure on the regime itself. I would differ from my colleague to my left in stating that there are actually explicit carve-outs, and in fact, the Treasury Department went to great lengths to explain some of the early concerns that the humanitarian assistance would get tied up in these sanctions. And so there's explicit carve-outs to ensure that humanitarian assistance continues to be able to be delivered in Venezuela. There is no doubt that the economic sanctions will have an impact on the population. But I, again, disagree respectfully with my colleague here in stating that they're not the cause of the crisis, and therefore, irrespective of where you fall in the sanctions, right, they're not the root cause of the reason why there is a humanitarian crisis, which there very much is.
Ramon, I want to go to you in Miami. You're a supporter of Juan Guaido, and he's recognized as the president by the U.S. and some 50 other nations. And although the sanctions, without question, are the goal of removing the regime, if you will, they're also arguably causing a great deal of hardship in the country where there's already suffering. What are your thoughts on the sanctions moving forward, and is this the proper way to go?
Well, let me start by saying that we strongly support the petition of President Juan Guaido for the international community to put even more pressure on Nicolás Maduro's regime. And we do support the sanctions by the U.S. government and, by the way, by other governments, but very especially from the U.S. government. We really think pressure must be continue and should increase in order for us to have a better chance of getting back to democracy in Venezuela. And let me subscribe with somebody else was saying before me, the sanctions are not the cause of the crisis. The crisis, it's very old, and the roots of the crisis, it's poor management, corruption, and a regime that it's just starving the Venezuelan people and doing everything they can to remain indefinitely in power in Venezuela.
Edgardo, you're the only one in our group that's on the ground in Venezuela, and you see this obviously quite a bit. How are the sanctions being viewed by the people in Venezuela, firstly? What are Venezuelans saying about it? And are these sanctions doing unfair harm to the people there, not only in terms of famine and hunger, but also driving them from the nation?
It's obvious that the sanctions themselves aren't the cause of the Venezuelan crisis, but they have certainly deepened the crisis in a very, very significant degree over the last 2 years. No matter what the schemes established say in terms of the possibility of buying food, medicine, etc., there is a severe impact because not only are no businesses allowed between Venezuela and the United States, but third parties, be it countries or companies, are threatened by, in terms of sanctions by the United States if they deal with Venezuela. So that's having a huge impact. Just this last week, we had the fact that one of the main state-owned companies, oil companies from China, of all countries, decided not to continue buying oil from Venezuela. We found that one of the main Turkish banks decided not to continue its relationships with the Venezuelan Central Bank. So these are sanctions across the board that are having a huge impact. These aren't the source of the crisis in Venezuela, but over the last 2 years, the crisis has dramatically increased, and it has a huge impact on Venezuelans' daily lives. If we look back to history, sanctions are not likely to conduce to any government change. If you go back to the experience of the 10-year sanction period in Iraq, you find that 500,000 children were killed, died as a consequence of sanctions.
I want to bring Max in as well. Max, we were talking earlier, I think that everybody agrees that sanctions are having some kind of impact on its citizens without question. But if you listen to what President Trump has been saying, he's floated the idea of having a naval blockade of Venezuela. Even the U.S. military says that it isn't something that could work well. Trump says all options are on the table. Do you think the people of Venezuela need to be concerned about the possibility of U.S. military intervention?
Well, it ain't going to happen. I mean, even Trump administration officials and people in the U.S. Southern Command know that a naval blockade would be impossible, but the sanctions have been enough to terrorize and deeply damage Venezuela's economy to prevent it, for example, from getting out of its inflationary crisis, which other Latin American countries have been able to do. And it's worth noting that by the time Nicolas Maduro offered the U.S. aid after the disaster of Hurricane Harvey, which it rejected, the Trump administration had already sanctioned his government 3 times that year. In fact, there's so many things that happen below the radar that we don't notice. 300,000 doses of insulin were not able to get into Venezuela in 2017, the year of the violent guarimbas, which were setting the streets on fire because Citibank refused to, they boycotted its purchase. This is the result of the Obama administration's designation of Venezuela as a national security threat in 2015. I want to ask Paula, because you were in the Obama administration, in what way was Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security? How does Venezuela threaten my security or the security of American citizens? Or was this not a tool to bring us to the crisis that we're in, to ratchet up Venezuela's economic crisis and harm ordinary civilians?
So just, if I may, go ahead and directly respond to that. So again, I would say from the Obama administration standpoint, the policy was very much one of support for the democratic movement in Venezuela.
Which one would that be?
It is never intended to be
the one that staged a military coup?
The Venezuelan
the movement that staged a military coup.
Please let her finish firstly.
Okay.
You asked her a specific question. She's trying to answer.
So I would just say, again, the policy was very much of support for democracy, support for democratic movement in Venezuela. It is never one to go after the Venezuelan people. I don't believe, certainly I know to be the case under the Obama administration, and I don't believe it to be the case today.
How was Venezuela a national security threat to the United States? That was the specific language of this designation. In what way?
I think.
I think there are many reasons to consider Venezuela and Maduro a threat to the U.S. population right here, right now, including drugs, including terrorism, support to terrorist groups, including Al Qaeda, including the Colombian guerrilla being in Venezuela. The mass migrations of Venezuelans destabilizing the economy and the governments of Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, and other countries.
How are they connected to Al Qaeda? Sorry, how are they connected to Al Qaeda? You've connected them to Al Qaeda. It was the Obama administration that provided weapons to Al Qaeda in Syria. We know that. But how is Maduro connected to Al Qaeda? This is ridiculous.
There is evidence that people from terrorist groups were at some point, or they may remain, but at some point they were in Venezuela and the Margarita Island, and they got passports from people like Tarek El Aissami, who was vice president at that time, and right now it's sanctioned by the U.S. as a drug kingpin. They got passports, they got logistics, they got space, they got money. So there's a support to those groups, at least it was in the past.
Okay,
but in addition to that, there's a huge drug issue regarding Venezuela.
Okay, hang on just a sec, Max, because I kind of want to move and bring Edgardo in for just a moment, because with all the other discussion going on, clearly we know right now that in Venezuela, the executive and legislative branches are not talking to each other. They don't recognize each other. Edgardo, give us a way that that nation is going to find a path forward.
Actually, there's some small light of optimism that can be felt in the country at this moment. After the attempt of a military coup by the Guaido people in April, there was a recognition by increasing proportions of the Venezuelan population that this politics of confrontation, this politics of friend-enemy, this notion of politics as a way to destroy and completely exterminate the enemy was conducing to a really severe possibility of civil war, of a U.S. military intervention, or a military coup, or increased government repression. So now there's a movement in Venezuelan society. The majority of the people in opinion polls want a solution that's a negotiated solution. Even people who are backing Maduro or Guaido right now would like to have a negotiated solution. And Oslo was our best chance. The sanctions that have been increased by the Trump administration this last few days are imposed with the purpose of derailing the negotiations. The United States government doesn't just want elections. It doesn't want just to get rid of Maduro. It wants to get rid of the whole experience of Chavismo, and it wants to give Latin American left and movements and political parties an example of what's not to be done. And so they want a complete defeat of Maduro.
Ramon?
Sanctions are not derailing the negotiations. Sanctions are actually promoting the negotiations and making Maduro more inclined to go and sit on the table. But that's without sanctions, forget about Maduro getting in a table and trying to reach any agreement. Even with sanctions, it will be extremely difficult for Maduro to reach an agreement, to go back to democracy and relent power.
I kind of want to bring
we need sanctions.
Our panel here, Max and Paula, in on this one, because there are obviously reports out there that Maduro is considering one option out there, which would call for new elections in 9 to 12 months. I think that's one thing that we heard Edgardo talking about just a moment ago, some kind of negotiated solution. Max, I'll start with you. Is that a good way to go, and will Maduro keep his word if indeed that happens?
Well, of course. And having been in Venezuela, talking to even people who are aligned with the opposition, who meet every Friday, including the business community, with the government of Maduro in the Boston group. They don't want these sanctions either. And so the Maduro government has offered to have elections soon if sanctions are lifted. According to Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, between 2015 and 2018, U.S. sanctions caused 40,000 excess deaths. And so they want to stop the death. And the U.S. won't allow that to take place. The U.S. will not allow the opposition of Juan Guaido, who are basically, I mean, I haven't seen this many puppets since the first season of Sesame Street. They're completely under the control of the U.S. And there is, however, a moderate opposition that would be able to help negotiate a way out of this crisis if the U.S. would stop its meddling in Venezuela, which is far worse than any St. Petersburg troll farm has done in the United States. It's actually killing people.
Let me bring you in on this. So your thoughts, can Maduro be trusted to keep his word? There really have not been fair elections down there in decades.
So a lot to respond to there, but I'll turn to your question first, and maybe we'll get back to some of those issues.
Okay.
I think obviously there's a history here in terms of past negotiations that have not actually come to yield the intended result. So there's some lack of trust on both sides. Right. I think that's certainly the case. I think the real question is elections under what conditions? There's the timeline question, but there's what's the electoral commission that is actually overseeing those elections? What do the election rolls look like? Who's allowed to vote? When does that election actually take place? Is Maduro able to stay in power through those elections? And then there's lots of questions for future discussion in terms of, is he able to run for office in the future? I would disagree with my colleague to my left in terms of Max, apologies. In terms of the U.S. government, I think without a doubt, to our other colleagues' comment, the U.S. sanctions are intended to play into and to be part of the context in which the negotiations are taking place. I don't think they're meant to derail it. In fact, there are the same high-level officials in the U.S. government have come out and very plainly stated that they believe that in a democracy, if to the degree that we are all supportive of a democratic movement, a democracy implies that there is a transition of power.
John Bolton condemned negotiations.
If I may finish.
They condemned the negotiations.
One is able to run an election and power can switch hands from one party to the other. And that Chavismo is able, and the Socialist Party will be able to run in this and in future elections and will have a chance in free and fair elections to compete for the right to govern again.
Edgardo, I'd like to bring you in again because the AP has claims that Vice President Diosdado Cabello has met with U.S. representatives, and we heard U.S. President Donald Trump talk about high-level discussions that have gone on between the U.S. and Venezuelan authorities. He said that just a few hours ago. Here's what he had to say.
We are in touch. We're talking to various representatives of Venezuela. We're helping Venezuela as much as we can. I don't want to say who, but we are talking at a very high level.
Edgardo, your thoughts on that, and is there a way, despite the rhetoric coming from John Bolton and others within the Trump administration, that these negotiations can move forward and they find some way to have some kind of legitimate election in Venezuela?
At this moment, I think the U.S. administration is the main obstacle to the possibility of negotiations. I don't know if Diosdado Cabello or anybody else had contact with high-level officials in the U.S. government. The U.S. government has said repeatedly that it's talking to different people in the army. They have said that people in the army were participating in the coup in April, and these are ways to attempt to create divisions and discontent within the armed forces and distrust within different people in the government. So I really wouldn't trust what the United States official line says, especially with such an irresponsible administration as the Trump administration. I think that it's really important to remember that Venezuela is a sovereign nation, that the United States has no right to decide the future of Venezuela.
But Venezuelans should have that right. We, the Venezuelan people, doesn't have that right either.
Edgardo, hang on a minute, because I'd like to pick up on what Ramon was talking about right now. The United States has a long history of intervening in other nations, especially in Latin America. Are you concerned, or is there reason for concern, that the United States could affect this self-governing? And if indeed Maduro leaves and Guaido becomes the new leader of the nation, Is there any reason to be concerned that the United States could have its tentacles, for lack of a better term, involved in that leadership?
Well, is that for me?
I
Well,
think
let me
that's
tell
quite
you.
obvious.
Ramon.
Yeah, I think we will have to transit a very long way back, first of all, to democracy, and then to real sovereignty. Like, we will need a lot of help from a lot of governments and institutions, and it will take a lot of time for Venezuela to be really, truly independent again. However, the first thing we need to accomplish is to get rid of Maduro. And if you give me 1 minute, there's something very important, just to be focused in the solution and not only the problem. The sanctions are a problem, yes. There's a way out of sanctions. Just go back to democracy and stop human rights violations. If you see the report by Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, if you read that report, I mean, she's talking about executions, torture, babies dying in hospital, starvation. So there's a way out of the sanctions. Just get back to democracy, stop human rights abuses, and you know, that's the smart way out of sanctions. And one more thing, Maduro. I guess a lot of Chinese audience is watching this program. Let me tell you this. Maduro is not working for the Venezuelan people, but it's also not working for the Chinese interest in Venezuela. There's no way
anybody's making
you will
that
get
connection
paid
right
back.
now. Paula, we're running out of time. I want to talk about
just
one
let
more
me
important.
a very quick point. Just to let you know, there's no way the Chinese government will recover the money or will get paid back while Maduro is in government. There's no way. I mean, Venezuela is just broke down by Maduro.
Okay, Paula, I also want to talk about the humanitarian issue. 4 million people have already fled that nation due to the poverty. It's impacting other nations. What can be done to help alleviate this issue?
So I think twofold. One is what's the humanitarian assistance that needs to make its way into Venezuela, needs to be distributed in a neutral fashion in accordance with UN principles of the neutrality and impartiality of that humanitarian assistance. There are systems that need to be rebuilt in terms of healthcare systems. There's a distribution of food, vaccinations, as we've discussed in the past, and the influx of medicines into the country. In addition to that, there's actually tremendous need both in the short and medium and long term in neighboring countries who have received these 4+ million.
Some kind of assistance.
Assistance to deal with the immediate humanitarian crisis and, quite frankly, the development needs for those folks who will not immediately return to Venezuela.
Let me give Max the last word here.
Well, there's so much to say, and the U.S. is now trying to sanction the main food distribution system in Venezuela, CLAP, which I don't hear you condemning for some reason. What we are witnessing is Venezuela in a fight for national survival. The U.S. wants to transform Venezuela into Honduras, which is a narco dictatorship run along neoliberal lines by the Inter-American Development Bank,
because we're running out
and
of time.
Colombia.
I apologize.
And we don't hear any discussion
we're
of
gonna
the
have to go
uprising in Honduras.
I appreciate the passion. I think all of you guys made some very, very good points, and I hope we all walk away here perhaps thinking about this in a different way. That does it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington, D.C., and thanks everyone for joining us.